Hello friends, how are you all? So my name is Pranay Mishra and in today's lecture we will be covering the important article of this year. You can see one of the most important article of this year. It basically talks about the climate change, okay? It talks about the body like United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change. Okay, it talks about its Conference of Parties 28. So let's begin with this article. So as you can see, why this article is in news? See, the 20th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change. It was held recently in Dubai, UAE, United Arab Emirates. Okay, so what is it? See, the first global conference on the climate change. It was basically held in 1972 in Stockholm, Switzerland. Okay, the conference assured the numerous global negotiation and the international agreements on the environment, and this led to the culmination into the establishment of the UNFCCC in Rio de Janeiro in Brazil 1992. Okay, so what has happened is, see, the global conference on the climate, it was held in 1972. Then the negotiation on the climate started. International agreements on the environment had started coming, which led to the establishment of the UNFCCC in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992. Okay. Now, basically, the UNFCCC is a multilateral treaty governing the action to combat the climate change. And how it will be happened? It will be done through the adaptation and mitigation, which is directed to control the emission of the greenhouse gas, which is causing the global warming. Okay. Now, this treaty sets limit on the global greenhouse gas emission, but it is not binding and there is no enforcement mechanism. So, whatever negotiation happened at the conference of parties, these negotiations are not legally binding or enforceable mechanism. Okay, at the United Nations Framework Convention on the Climate Change. However, there are provisions for update or protocols that can be used to set legally binding emission limits on the countries. So what is happening here is that, see, in the negotiation, we can come up with a provision that can be used to set the legal binding emission limit on the countries. Okay, so each countries can set the nationally determined contribution, and there can be a legal binding limit as to, okay, for example, say 100 unit. You cannot emit more than 100 unit. Okay, so there can be provision like that. Okay, now the parties to the convention, they meet annually in the conference of parties 20 in the conference of parties. Why? To review the progress under the convention. Okay, so this is basically in this article. So first, I will show you where has conference of parties 28 has happened. See, this is an Arabian Peninsula, and here you can see UAE. In UAE, there is a Dubai, and here the conference of parties 28 meet has happened. So from the geographical point of view, in any exam, you need to know the location where it is, where the UAE is, where the UAE is in the map. So here you can see there is a Persian Gulf, and here it is the Gulf of Oman. Okay, here you can see there is Iran. Okay, so you need to know the location of the UAE and the Gulf which is near to its location, and the countries which are bordering it. You need to know the location. Okay, so let's move ahead with this article. What are the outcomes of this conference of parties 28? Okay, so the loss and damage fund has been operationalized in this. Okay. See, the conference of parties 27, what has happened is the loss and damage fund should be established, and the agreement was reached on that, but it was not operationalized. Okay. But in the conference of parties 28, the members of the countries, they agreed, and an agreement is reached to operationalize this loss and damage fund. And what this loss and damage fund will do is to compensate the countries which are grappling with the climate change impact. Okay. Now, and the World Bank will host the fund for 4 years. It will see the operation of this fund. Okay. Now, all the developing countries, they are eligible to apply to this loss and damage fund. And every country is invited to contribute in this fund voluntarily. Now, A specific percentage is earmarked for the least developed countries and the small and developing states in this fund. Okay, so the most important article of the most important outcome of this conference is the establishment of the loss and damage fund, which will be looked after by the World Bank. Okay, all the developing countries can apply in it, all the countries can contribute in it, and in this fund a particular amount of money is earmarked for the least developed countries and the developing states. Okay, now the second important point, see the global stock take test. Now what is it? Basically the global stock take, it is a periodic review mechanism which is established under the Paris Agreement in 2015. Okay, now the global stock text was released at the Conference of Parties 28 and it was adopted with no objections. Okay. Now the text proposed the 8 steps to keep the global temperature rise within the ambit of 1.5 degrees Celsius. Now what are the steps which it proposes? See, it says that we have to triple the renewable energy capacity globally and double the energy efficiency by 2030. The global stock take text, okay, it talks about tripling of the renewable energy and doubling of the energy efficiency by 2030. Okay, now as you can see, when there is a power transmission or where there is a power generation, there are multiple losses in the energy. Okay, so this global stock take, it talks about doubling the energy efficiency and tripling the renewable energy capacity, okay, by 2030. Now, apart from it, it also talks about phase down of the coal power. Okay, phase down of the, see, in the coal power, in the thermal power station, what happens is there is a lot of carbon dioxide and other gases are being emitted. So there is an urgent need to combat this global rise in temperature through the carbon dioxide by phasing down the coal power. Okay. Now, apart from it, it also talks about accelerating the effort toward the net zero emission energy system and utilizing zero and low carbon fuels. Okay. So this is one of the main thing. Apart from it, it also talks about accelerating zero and low emission technologies, renewable nuclear and other technologies which can be used. Why? So that we can accelerate it towards the goal of zero and low emission. Okay. Apart from it, it also talks about the carbon capture and carbon storage, and the hydrogen production should be, see, what is happening actually is in this global stock take, it basically talks about we have to lower the emissions. Okay, we have to go for the carbon capture and the carbon storage. And how it will happen? See, there are many technologies, uh, such as in the chimneys of the power plant. You can see there are some devices which are kept. So these devices, what they basically do is they filter out the pollution, they capture the carbon. In even the vehicles, you can see at the exhaust there are some carbon capture devices. So these carbon capture devices can be used, to capture and store the carbon, which will reduce the emission and the effect of the global greenhouse gas. Okay, so this global stock take basically talks about accelerating zero and low emission technologies. Okay, it talks about the net zero emission and utilizing the low carbon fuel. It talks about the more and more utilization of the nuclear and the renewable energy powers. Okay, now it also talks about transitioning away from the fossil fuels. See, basically, at the start of the conference, the countries were demanding that we should phase out the fossil fuel. But due to the opposition from the many Arab countries or many developed countries and many industrialized countries, it was decided that okay, complete phase out of the fossil fuel will not be possible. So we will transition. So we will transitioning away from the fossil fuel. Okay, and transitioning away means step by step we will move away from the fossil fuel. Okay, in an orderly and an equitable manner, and we will try to achieve it. We will try to achieve the net zero by 2050 in keeping with the science. Okay, so this is the main thing. Okay, so Apart from it, there are also discussions regarding the substantially reducing the carbon dioxide emission. And what are this? Basically, it is talk about the methane emission. See what has happened in the conference of parties 26, okay, which has happened in the Glasgow, UK. Uh, there a pledge has been taken, which is called as the methane pledge. Okay, and in it was pledged that some countries, nearly about 100 countries, they pledged that they will reduce their methane emission because it is one of the potent greenhouse gas which is contributing the rise in the global temperature. Okay, so it was discussed that there we will take effort to reduce the non-carbon dioxide emission, including the methane. Okay, and accelerating the emission reduction from the road transport is also one of the discussed point because the road transport, you can see the vehicular emission causes the emission of the carbon dioxide gas and other gases they like sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide and all. So the emission reduction from the road transport is also very essential to reduce the impact of the global climate change. Okay, so for this it was decided that there should be rapid infrastructural development. Okay, and deployment of the low emission and or low emission vehicles like e-vehicles or the vehicle running on the CNG, you can say, or the vehicle running on the hydrogen fuel, okay, or the hybrid vehicles, they can be used to reduce the emission. Okay, apart from that, phasing out of the efficient fossil fuel subsidies is also discussed. So you can see many a times the fossil fuel subsidies are given, which basically encourages the wasteful consumption, and we want to reduce that so that we can address the issue of the climate change. See, not all the fossil fuel subsidies are wasteful. You also have to remember this point that not all the fossil fuel subsidies are wasteful. Some of the fossil fuel subsidies are given to address the energy poverty because in many countries there are many people who cannot afford the basic facilities, so energy subsidies given. Why? So that the energy poverty can be addressed, so that the basic need of energy can be achieved and the development process can happen, but the wasteful consumption leading to the fossil fuel subsidies is strictly prohibited. Okay, and the phasing out of the inefficient fuel subsidy that encouraging the wasteful consumption has been promoted in this conference. Okay, apart from that, the conference of parties 26 in Glasgow. Okay, as I have told earlier also, so it is so this text of Conference of Parties, it is in continuity with this Conference of Parties 26 in the Glasgow meet. Okay, which basically balances the global aspiration of the countries like India with the diverse energy needs. Because in the Conference of Parties 26 in the Glasgow, it was decided that we will phase down the carbon. Okay, we will phase down the use of the coal in the energy generation. Not completely phase out, but the phase down. Similarly, in the Conference of Parties 28, we decided transition from the fossil fuel, not phase out of the fossil fuel. So in this context, you can the relative comparison, you can see the Conference of Parties 26 and the Conference of Parties 28. They are to some extent we can see matching. Okay. Now India, what are the Indian arguments? See, India argues the continuous use of the coal to meet its developmental need. And it emphasizes the importance of adhering to the nationally determined contribution. So, what has India said? India said that, okay, see, we need coal. Why? Because we want to maintain the standard of living of our country. We need development. We need our gross domestic product to increase. Okay, we need poverty alleviation, and for this, energy is important. And in India, more than 50-60% of the energy is generated through the coal. Okay, so the importance of coal in energy generation is very important in India. So India had said that we cannot phase down. the coal completely, but we will be ensuring that we limit our emission by adhering to the nationally determined contribution. So, what is nationally determined contribution? See, in the Conference of Parties 21 in Paris 2015, it was decided that the country will set the nationally determined contribution to limit the emission. They will set the target that okay, by this much amount we will reduce our emission. Okay, so these are basically the nationally determined contribution which came in 2015 Conference of Parties 21, okay, which has happened in Paris. So nearly 200 countries agreed to transition away from the fossil fuel in the energy system in the Conference of Parties 28. This is the most important point of the Conference of Parties 28 is the transitioning away from the fossil fuel. Okay. Now, this deal, it aims to signal to the policymakers and the investors that the world is committed to breaking away from the fossil fuel. Okay, so transitioning away from the fossil fuel, breaking away from the fossil fuel is basically a commitment which the investors and the policy makers of the world are making. Now, developing and the poor countries, they express their dissatisfaction with this latest draft of this global stocktake at the Conference of Parties 28. Why? See, the poor countries or the small island countries are the most vulnerable countries to the climate change, and they want some drastic steps to be taken at the international level. But the developed countries, which are energy dependent on the fossil fuel, they just tone down this Conference of Parties 28, and the drastic steps are not being taken. So the poor countries are really means poor countries are to some extent disappointed through this global stock take at the Conference of Parties 28. Okay. Now, several countries, including the India, are extremely opposed to the mandate of the methane emission. As I have said earlier, also at the Conference of Parties 26 at the Glasgow, UK, it was decided a methane pledge was taken where it was decided that the methane emission will be reduced, but it was not legally binding. Okay, and countries like India opposed this methane emission reduction. Why? Because India is an agricultural country. Okay, most of our population depends on the agriculture for employment. Okay, and the methane emission basically takes place from agriculture. Okay, and the livestock rearing. Because in the anaerobic fermentation, you can see the livestock basically they emit methane, and in the agricultural production such as rice cultivation, methane is emitted. So, and India being an agricultural country, so it opposed the mandate to cut the ethane emission. Okay. Apart from it, the methane emission, it involved tweaking the agricultural practices. Means we have to substantially change our agricultural practices if we want to cut the methane. Okay, because country like India, which is extremely sensitive to this. Okay, and so possibly in difference to the concern of such countries such as India and other developing countries, the agreement does not mention any target for the methane emission cut by the year 2030. Okay, so by 2030, there are no emission target for the methane emission. And as I have said earlier that 100 countries had made a voluntary commitment in the Glasgow in 2021 Conference of Parties 26 to reduce the methane emission by 30% by 2030, which is the global methane pledge. And India is not the part of this global methane pledge. Okay. Now, developing countries call on a rich nation to achieve the negative carbon emission, not just net zero by 2050. So basically, the developing countries they say that okay, that the developed countries or rich countries uh, they are basically responsible for the emission. They are basically responsible for the rise in temperature. So that these developed countries should try to achieve the negative carbon emission, not the zero carbon emission by 2050. Okay, these are the some of the demand which are made by the developing countries. And they also emphasize on the common but differentiated responsibilities. Why? Because as I have said earlier, the developed countries are mostly responsible for this emission. So the developing countries demand that there should be common responsibility to reduce the emission, but it should be differentiated. Differentiated means that there should be differential target for the developing countries and the developing countries to achieve this net zero emission, to achieve the targets of lowering the greenhouse gas emission. Okay. Now the developing countries, they argue that the rich nation, they have consumed over 80% of the global carbon budget. Okay, because these developed countries, they have most of the industries, they emit large proportion of this carbon dioxide and other gases, and they consume over 80% of the global greenhouse budget. So they should allow the developing countries to have their fair share in the emission. Why? Because the developing countries also need this coal-based or other fossil fuel-based products for their GDP growth, for their development. So the developed countries should allow the developing nation to have their share in their emission. Okay. Now, apart from this, what has been decided is the Global Renewable and Energy Efficiency Pledge. Now, it has been decided, it has been pledged to triple the world installed renewable energy generation capacity. Okay, to how much? To nearly 11,000 gigahertz by 2030. So it has been pledged to triple the renewable energy capacity by 2030 to at least 11,000 gigawatts. Okay, and to double the energy efficiency by 2030 from 2% currently to 4% we want to do every year until 2030. Okay. Now, apart from that, there is a global cooling pledge for Conference of Parties 28. Now, what is this global cooling pledge? See, basically, it calls to reduce the cooling related emission across all the sectors by at least 68% globally, relatively to 2022 levels by 2050. Okay, now global cooling pledge basically what it says that while using the cooling system, for example AC, refrigerators and all, what happens is the greenhouse gas emission comes out. ठीक है, chlorofluorocarbon, tetrafluorocarbon gases emit, which causes the global greenhouse gas emission problem. So the global cooling pledge it calls for to reduce this greenhouse gas emission from the cooling system by at least 68% by 2050. But countries like India are not in favor of this. Why? Because see, we need this. We need energy for cooling purpose, for the medicinal equipments and the medicinal and for the medicine. Basically, you can see there are many vaccines, many medicines which are stored at the cool place. Okay, and the energy required for storing these medicines or vaccines in the cool place, this energy comes from the fossil fuel. Okay, so the global cooling pledge has been taken to reduce this emission from the cooling system. Okay, and India opposed to this because we need the energy for the cooling system to store the medicines. Okay, and other vaccinations. Now, climate finance. Now, what about this climate finance? So, the United Nations Conference on the Trade and Development, it estimates that the developed nation, that this wealthy nation, they owe the developing countries nearly $500 billion in 2025 under the new collective quantified goal for climate finance. Okay. Now, this new collective quantified goal was confirmed by the developed countries under the Paris Agreement in 2015. Okay, in the Paris Agreement in 2015, it was decided that yearly the developed countries will contribute nearly $100 billion per year to combat the climate change. So, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, it says that the wealthy nation now owes the developing countries nearly $500 billion in 2025 under the new collective quantified goal for the climate finance, which was confirmed by the developed countries under the Paris Agreement in 2015. Okay, the goal will start from a floor of $100 billion per year, as I have mentioned earlier also. ठीक है, and this fund will be used for mitigation, for climate change mitigation, adaptation and loss and damage. Okay, now the figure is expected to increase to $1.55 trillion by 2030. Why? Because in the Conference of Parties to 21 to in 2015 at the Paris, it was decided that the countries will contribute nearly $100 billion per year to combat, to mitigate for adaptation and loss and damage for the climate change. Okay, so this amount will be nearly equal to $1.55 trillion by 2030. But the countries have now not but the developed countries had not contributed to this amount. Okay. Now the current climate finance goal of the USD of the $100 billion per year has not been made, and the developing countries, they are facing the debt distress. The developing countries, they demand that the developed countries should contribute the money so that the developing countries can adapt, can mitigate, can adjust to this climate change. Okay. Now, expert call for the reform of the global financial architecture to address the structural issue and promote the sustainable development. Okay, so there is a need for the financial architectural reform. Now, the global goal for the adaptation. Now, this draft text on the global goal on the adaptation, it was introduced. See, under the Paris Agreement to enhance the climate adaptation, it was decided that the funding will be done for the adaptation need to limit the global rise in temperature by 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius under the Paris Agreement. So, but the climate financing has not been up to the level. So, the global goal on the adaptation was introduced. Now, this draft text on the global goal on the adaptation, it talks about the critical issues such as the climate-induced water scarcity reduction. So, due to the climate change, there is a water scarcity problem. Water level is, you can see the erratic monsoon, erratic rainfall. ठीक है so there are problem of water scarcity, which is the result of the climate change. And the global goal on the adaptation talks about this, about combating this water scarcity induced by the climate change. It talks about the agriculture which is resilient to this climate change. We have to develop the sustainable agricultural practices which are resilient to this climate change. This global goal on the adaptation talks about this. Apart from that, it also talks about strengthening resilience against the climate related health impact. See, due to the climate change, what is happening is there are many health impacts on the human. Okay, so to counter this, it has been decided that the it has been decided to strengthen the resilience against this climate related health impact by contributing the funds. Okay, now there is also a declaration to triple the nuclear energy capacity by 2050. Also, okay, we as we want to move away from the carbon dioxide emission and to curb the greenhouse gas emission, to combat the climate change, there is also a declaration to triple the nuclear energy capacity by 2050, which is endorsed by nearly 22 nations. Okay, which who advocate for incorporation of this nuclear energy in the energy lending policies. Okay, as you know that many countries don't have the enough nuclear material such as uranium for the production of this nuclear energy. So the energy lending policy should be there so that the shift to the nuclear energy production can be happen. Okay. Apart from that, there is the Powering Past Coal Alliance. Now, what is this Powering Past Coal Alliance? It is basically a coalition of the national and the subnational government. It also includes businesses and other organizations which are working to transition from the unabated coal power generation to a clean energy. Okay, basically this coalition of the national government of the business organization, they basically talks about the transitioning away from the coal power generation to the clean energy. Okay, and Coal Transitioning Accelerator. This is also basically a France in collaboration with the various organization and the various country. It introduced the Coal Transition Accelerator with the objective of knowledge sharing, policy design, and the financial support to facilitate transitioning from the coal to clean energy. Okay, so this coal transition accelerator you also need to know, which is basically France led, uh, which is introduced to transition away from the coal by knowledge sharing, policy design, and financial support to transition away from the coal to the clean energy. Now, there is also a CHAMP partnership for the climate action. Now, what is this CHAMP stand for? CHAMP is basically a coalition for the high ambition multi-level partnership. Now, this coalition for the high ambition multi-level partnership for the climate change. In this total, nearly 65 national governments signed this CHAMP partnership commitment to enhance the cooperation in planning, financing, implementing, and monitoring the climate strategies. Okay. Now, at this Conference of Parties 28, what are the Indian-led initiatives? Okay, so in this is very important. You need to know for this exam, any exam, government exam, you need to know this. Okay. Now, India-led initiative at the Conference of Parties 28. First initiative is the Global River City Alliance. Now, what is this Global River City Alliance? See, it was launched at the Conference of Parties 28 and it is led by the National Mission for Clean Ganga under the Ministry of Jal Shakti Government of India. Okay, at the Conference of Parties 28, India led an initiative which is called as the Global River Cities Alliance. Okay, and it was led by basically the National Mission for Clean Ganga under the Ministry of Jal Shakti, which is a unique alliance covering the 275 plus global river cities in 11 countries and countries such as Egypt, Netherlands, Denmark, Ghana, Australia, Bhutan, Cambodia, Japan. These are the countries, these among the 11 countries, which are the river cities. ठीक है these they will they have they these countries have joined this alliance for the global river cities. Okay, so what basically it is the sustainable development of these river cities. Okay, now these river centric cities, you as you can see in the traditional time also, many of the cultural civilization has developed around the river area. Okay, river centric development has happened. So this river centric development should be sustainable. Otherwise, there will be a lot of river pollution. And as you can see, the water is already a scarce resource. So the river centric sustainable development should happen, which is suggested by the India through this Global River City Alliance. Okay. Now, in this, there should be a knowledge exchange, city twinning, and dissemination of the best practices in this platform will happen. Okay, so you need to remember in this is the river city twinning. Okay, for example, you can take for example like twinning with the city of Delhi with the Shanghai you can take. So the river city twinning can happen. Okay, knowledge sharing can happen, dissemination of the best practices can happen, so so that these river cities can develop in a sustainable manner. Apart from that, there is also green credit initiative proposed by India in this conference of parties 28. Now, what is this green credit initiative? It is basically to create a participatory global platform for the exchange of innovative environmental programs and the instruments. Okay, so what is basically it is? It is basically a platform where we will be sharing the innovative environmental programs to combat this climate change, such as water conservation related programs or afforestation, water management, sustainable agricultural, tree plantation. What are the innovative methods through which we can conserve the water? We can do the afforestation. We can do the waste management. These practices will be shared in this Green Credit Initiative. Okay. So, which is basically an Indian led initiative. Now, the Conference of Parties 28, basically, I will tell you some important fact about it. See, it is the supreme decision making body, which is it? It is the Conference of Parties. Highest decision making body is the United Nations Framework for the Climate Change. Now, it basically meets every year. Okay. And the first Conference of Parties to the UNFCCC. It was held in Berlin, Germany in the year 1995. And its UNFCCC secretariat is in Bonn. Okay. Now, some of the important conference of parties to the United Nations framework to the climate change. You need to know this because in exam, many a times it is asked that what is Kyoto Protocol or what is the Marrakesh Treaty or what is the Delhi Declaration. So you need to know about this. Okay. So the conference of parties and their major outcomes, some of the major outcomes you need to remember. So in the year 1997, in the conference of parties meet 3, COP3, which has happened in the Kyoto, Japan, it adopted the Kyoto Protocol. Now, this Kyoto Protocol was basically legally binding. Okay, it legally binded the developed countries to reduce the emission. Okay. Now, in the Conference of Parties 7, 2001, which has happened in the Marrakesh, Morocco, a Marrakesh Accord was signed and a stage was set for the ratification of the Kyoto Protocol. Now, in the Conference of Parties 8, 2002, a New Delhi Declaration was developed. Now, what this new Delhi Declaration calls for? It calls for the developmental needs of the poorest countries. It calls for the technology transfer for the climate change for this mitigation. Okay. Now, the Conference of Parties 13, which has happened in Bali, Indonesia in 2007, it basically calls for a Bali roadmap and a Bali action plan on a shared vision, mitigation, adaptation, technology, and financing. Okay, so Bali roadmap, what basically talks about? It talks about the mitigation, adaptation, technology transfer, and the financial. Okay, so in 2008, as we move forward, Conference of Parties 48 has happened in the Poland, Poznan. Okay, and here the adaptation fund under the Kyoto Protocol was launched. Okay, now in 2009 Conference of Parties 15 at the Copenhagen, Denmark, developed countries pledged of to $30 billion in the fast start finance. Okay, in the Copenhagen Conference of Parties 15 2009, developed countries pledged to nearly $30 billion in the finance. Now, in 2010, in the Conference of Parties 16, Cancun, Mexico, a Cancun agreement was held where it was decided to establish a green climate fund. Okay, so question can be asked that what has happened in the Kyoto Protocol, or what is the Bali Roadmap, or what is the Cancun Agreement, or when were the Green Climate Fund word was established. So you need to know in the Conference of Parties 16, which has happened in the Cancun, Mexico, a Green Climate Fund was established. Okay. Now, as we move ahead in the Conference of Parties 18, 2012, at the Doha, Qatar, Doha Agreement to the Kyoto Protocol. Basically, Doha, it amended the Kyoto Protocol. Okay, what had it said that reducing the greenhouse emission by 18% compared to the 1990 level. It was decided at the Conference of Parties 18 Doha. Okay, now at the Conference of Parties 19 2013 at the Warsaw, Poland, Warsaw Framework for the Read Plus and the Warsaw International Mechanism for the Loss and Damage was been discussed. Okay, now in the Conference of Parties 28, 21, what has happened? See, in the Conference of Parties 21, Paris, it is one of the most important stuff which you need to know. Okay, so in this Conference of Parties 21, which has happened in the Paris Agreement, it was decided that we have to limit the rise in temperature by nearly 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century, as compared to the pre-industrial era. So, okay, so this Conference of Party 21 was one of the most important conference of the Paris Agreement. Okay, here it was decided to climate finance by the rich countries. Nearly $100 billion funding pledge by the rich countries has been taken. Okay. Now, as we move forward in the Conference of Parties 24 in 2018 at Katowice, Poland, a rule book for the Paris Agreement was prepared, and the actions to be taken as per the nationally determined contribution will be taken. Okay. Now, in the Conference of Parties 26, as I had discussed in this lecture also in an elaborate manner, this Conference of Parties 26, which has happened in the Glasgow, UK, it was here that India announced that the net zero target will be achieved by 2030. Okay, in this Conference of Parties 26 at the Glasgow, UK, India announced that we will achieve the net zero emission by 2030. Now, what is basically this net zero? Mean how much carbon emission we will done, we will also capture this. So the net emission will be zero. It does not mean that okay, we will not emit anything. It does not mean that the net zero is like this. Net zero means whatever we will emit, we will capture it and restore it. This means net zero emission. So India announced the net zero emission by 2017. Okay. Apart from it, India called for the phase down of the coal based power. Okay, so as I have told you also, we have emphasized on the phase down of the coal-based power, and apart from it, there was also Glasgow breakthrough agenda. Okay, now apart from it, now there is was also a conference of parties 27. Now at the conference of parties 27, 2022, which has happened at the Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. It was decided that the loss and damage fund will be established. Okay. Apart from it, an early warning system will also be established. It was decided. So, as I have told you also, that at the Conference of Parties 27, 2022, which has happened at the Sharm el Sheikh in the Egypt, loss and damage fund was established in the Conference of Parties 27, but it was operationalized in the Conference of Parties 28. Okay. Now, G7 led global shield financing facilities was also established here. Okay. Apart from it, the African Carbon Market Initiative was also undertaken. Okay. It was decided that African Carbon Market Initiative will be established. An action for the water adaptation and resilience will be initiative will be taken. And one of the most important thing in the Conference of Parties 27 was the Mangrove Alliance in partnership with India. Okay, you can also see in the prelims paper of 2023 there is a question about the Mangrove Alliance. Okay, so Mangrove Alliance was also launched in partnership with the India in the Conference of Parties 27, and India's long-term low-emission development strategy was also put forward. So this is basically the main stuff in this article. Okay, so I hope you understood all the important factors in this article, and I hope you really like the session. So thank you and have a nice day. And if you like this session, please comment and subscribe.